So thank you for reading that, Tom. Yeah, I think that excerpt beautifully illustrates many of the themes of the book. It is a part travelogue. It is a part history of the early church, and it's part textual study. And I think it all in service, I think, of a larger question, one that I think that Isabel and Arthur suggest, which is, we know our religion, but not our history, which to me kind of goes to the heart of the book, and particularly that's to say the history of the early church and what would later then become Christianity as we know it, and how that's such a tricky theme to discern, particularly if you want to begin by looking at, as we do here, the apostles. So let me start off with that. Let me ask you this. So what do we mean, just so everyone's on the same page, what we're talking about when you mean the apostles, and what do we know of them?
So in the Gospels are our primary accounts of the apostles, and there's not really that much about them in the Gospels. Of course, there's Acts of the Apostles, but the weird question of Acts of the Apostles is that it's not that much about the apostles. Most of it's about Paul, who was not technically one of the 12 apostles. So the apostles apparently begin as a very Jewish idea, which is that Jesus chose 12 followers that, according to the Gospels, he somehow intended as future judges that would stand in judgment over the reunited 12 tribes of Judaism when the Messiah came and all Jews reunited in Jerusalem in the end times. And so they begin as this eschatological, apocalyptic idea. That's the best anyone can think. Why 12? 12 is a very important number in Judaism because it was a number of tribes, Jewish tribes that existed. And most of them were lost, in prehistory. And so this was the great historical trauma of Judaism. And so Jesus had these 12 followers, and then they eventually go from Jewish judges to the cornerstones upon which all Christian orthodoxy is built. And the early church was very adamant that all their beliefs had apostolic descent, that people believe this, or they believe this, or we celebrate Easter on this day because John, who people we know knew, told us that this is when John celebrated Easter, so this is when we celebrate Easter. And we know this prayer or this hymn because Peter passed it down through this person, and we know this person. And so apostolic descent became a crucial part of what Christians in certain communities believed.
And why was that? Is that because, given the paucity of information about the early church, this was maybe the only connection we had to knowing what it was that were the instructions of Christ?
A bunch of things. So I don't know how in depth we want to get into this, but early Christianity, the very first few decades of it, it was a Jewish, or at least heavily Jewish tinged belief system. That began to change when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, which scattered all the most prominent Jewish Christians throughout the Near East. And after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70, and then even more so after the second destruction of Jerusalem in 130, at the Second Jewish Revolt against Rome, these two events are basically the determinant of all of modern history. Jewish Christianity sort of ceases to exist, and Gentile Christianity is the only thing that's left. And it was a very strong source of embarrassment to Gentile Christianity that these Jewish Christians still sort of dwindlingly existed, and they claimed that they had sort of direct tutorial descent from Jesus' original followers. And one of my theses in the book is that the apostles became very important because they were all preaching in what I call comfortably foreskinned lands, reaching out to non-Jews, reaching out to non-Semites, reaching out to Gentiles, and they became heroes of this missionary effort. It's not completely non-historical, it's all totally legendary material, but by showing that these 12 names listed in the Gospels, very few of whom have any kind of character in the Gospels, there's only a couple of them that are depicted doing anything in particular, by making them the heroes of this missionary outreach beyond the Jewish world and into the Gentile world, I think Gentile Christianity kind of co-opted Jesus' original followers and turned the evident embarrassment that Gentile Christianity had this very powerful forerunner, Jewish Christianity, it sort of turned that embarrassment and made it a positive thing, which was that actually, you know, the Jewish Christians were wrong all the time. It was always about Gentile Christianity. Look at what the apostles did. They were in Scythia, they were in Gaul, they were in the British Isles, they were in Egypt. They went to all these places. And so I think they became a tool that the later church used to base its own legitimacy on.
Right, so let's talk about that a little bit more. So, because in the course of reading the book, and for those of you with some familiarity with this, there is a sort of, for lack of a better word, we call it a schism that arises. You have two apostles, one of whom, I guess you could call him an apostle, but he never knew Christ. That would have been Paul. Paul is famously, does not have the conversion on the road to Damascus. He had been oppressing Christian, what then were considered Christians, would have been Christian Jews.
They weren't called Christians at the time.
Nazarenes?
Nazarenes, followers of the way.
And so he then has this conversion. He becomes Paul. And from what you write, he seems to be, at least compared to the other apostles, seem charismatic. His writing, at least the writing that's attributed to him, seems to definitely have more flair than that of the other apostles. And then standing, if you will, not necessarily perhaps opposed to him, but counter to him, is Peter. Before I talk a little bit more about Paul, can you tell us about Peter?
So Peter was pretty evidently the most famous of Jesus' early disciples. A lot of people knew about him. He's mentioned a lot in the non-canonical Christian literature. Gospels that weren't included in the New Testament, he comes up a lot as a figure. And so I think sort of every Christian understanding kind of had to reckon with Peter, because he was evidently someone who got around. Paul mentions him having somehow been involved with Corinth, which was one of his communities. Whether Peter went there, Peter wrote a letter there, or people there knew Peter, who knows? No one can really know these questions. It's very complicated and abstract. But Paul and Peter had a confrontation in Antioch, which Paul had a community there. Peter showed up. Peter was eating with Gentiles, and some people from Jerusalem came and said, "What are you doing? You were sharing a common table with Gentiles. You're eating improperly butchered meat," whatever the nature is, some dietary law had been followed. Peter was embarrassed, and he evidently, and this is all on Paul's account, Peter left the table, and Paul confronted him, saying, you know, this is wrong. You shouldn't do this. You should keep eating with the people you're eating. Jesus obliterates difference. And Paul apparently lost that argument. And he writes that a lot of the people in the church, including Barnabas, who'd been his really close ally at this point, turned against him. And so what we can see from this is that in the first few decades, there was a schism. How Jewish was Christianity going to be? Obviously, belief in Jesus meant some deviation from traditional Jewish beliefs, but how much and to what degree? And it seems Paul believed that Jesus obliterated the difference between Jew and Gentile. And the Jewish Christians believed that what Jesus did was welcome Gentiles into an amended pact with Yahweh. Because prior to Jesus, Jews believed Gentiles were sort of excluded from the pact of Gentile. There were a lot of what are called God-fearers, which were Gentiles who may even get circumcised, may even go to synagogue, may obey certain Jewish dietary laws, but they were not considered Jews. But they showed up for these services because a lot of Greeks and Romans were very interested in other religions. They were kind of religious faddists. And the great irony is that of all the gods that Greeks and Romans came into contact with their expansionist sort of march across the world, the Jewish God was the only one who punished apostates with death. They'd never met a God like the Jewish God. And so they were very fascinated by this. And so a lot of them like kind of hedged their bets. Like, well, if the Jews are right, we should probably at least sort of show up.
Yeah, we've heard their God is a
We've
jealous
heard their
God.
God is a very tough God. So Paul and Peter had this conflict. How serious it was, whether or not that they like maintained their friendship, whatever. No one really knows the answer to these questions. But it is proved that like within 30 years of Jesus' death, Paul and the leadership of the Jerusalem church, represented by Peter in this case, disagreed about some very fundamental questions about what belief in Jesus meant.
And then, basically, I guess you could argue that is the term Paulist or Pauline?
Pauline.
The Pauline view triumphs.
It does, yeah.
And next thing you know, we have a church in Rome. And then now we have this.
Well, let's talk about why triumphed really quickly.
Yes.
It was a much more attractive view. You had a civilization in which economic stratification was hideous. It was one of the most economically unequal societies in the world. 20 to 30% of everyone was a slave. And here's this religious view saying, it doesn't matter if you're a slave, it doesn't matter if you're poor. We're all equal before this person who obliterated earthly difference. There's no man and woman, there's no slave and free person, there's no Jew and Gentile, we're all equal before Christ. That would have been an exciting thing as hell. That would have been exciting as hell for a lot of Gentiles to have heard, because all they knew about the Jewish God was that if they were a Gentile, you couldn't even enter the temple. You know, you had to get circumcised, which was a pretty unappealing thing to contemplate for someone
Yes.
before like the rise of bacteriology and anesthesia. It would have been a really rough process to want to do. So I think Paul's message won because it was a far more appealing one.
And so much so that the religion, part of the cliche, spreads like wildfire to all parts of the Mediterranean world and beyond. And now we get to the part of the book that's the travelogue, and you go and you visit, I guess you call them shrines to some of the various apostles, including, if you want to talk about this one too, the Thomas, the church for Thomas in, am I pronouncing correctly, Chennai?
Chennai.
Which used to be known as Madras in India.
Yeah, does everyone know that Indian Christianity is one of the oldest Christian communities in the world? There have been Christians there since the 3rd century, the 4th century. And so they're really, and it's a form of Christianity that's was deemed sort of heretical in the 5th and 6th century by the sort of proto-Catholic Church. And it had to do with the nature of Jesus' divinity in Mary's womb. And it's a very complicated theological judgment that I won't bore you with, but suffice it to say that the Christians that reached India were adherents of this doctrinally heretical, quote-unquote, view of Christianity. So when the Portuguese showed up in India in the 1400s, they sort of got off their boats and saw these brown-skinned people and were like, "We've come to bring you Jesus." And they were all like, "Yeah, we know about Jesus. There's a bunch of us here that sort of know all about it." And they were like astonished that not only were there Christians in India, but they were Christians that believed in this form of Christianity that they had thought that they had vanquished from Europe in the Near East hundreds and hundreds of years ago. So it's a really amazing fact that Indian Christianity is, I mean, they were Christians 1,000 years before the Swedes were Christians, if you can believe that. 500 years before Lithuanians and Russians were. Well, not Russians were 900. Yeah, 500 years before the Russians were, 1,000 years before the Swedes were. So their Christianity predates most of Europe's Christianity.
And as you visit all these various shrines, each one of them indeed encapsulates a sort of thinking about Christianity of its time and its place. Which also brings up something else in the book that I found fascinating, just in terms of this is the textual study, which sounds dry, but it's not, because now you have a situation where you realize that two things, and this addresses the general question about the apostles. Well, first of all, who is writing their stuff, so to speak? So you have the Gospels, Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John.
Only 2 of whom were apostles.
Okay, only 2 more apostles, and it's not clear who's writing these stories that often do not align in terms of what people's motives might have been for doing something, or what was actually said, or how it came down. And then you have all the various letters to the different congregations, the Corinthians, Thessalonians, Ephesians, the Philippians, etc., etc. And some of them may have been written by Peter, or may not.
Peter's letters are called the letters of Peter. John's letters are called the letters of John.
And I think at one point you say that it's not clear that Peter might have written Peter.
Most scholars would say that Peter's letters were not written by Peter.
So So who is shaping all this? Who is putting down the narrative, so speaking? Not only putting down the narrative, do it in such a way, you bring up this wonderful term, harmonizing, this harmonization, to sort of smooth everything out so that possibly all these things link up.
That's a very long, complicated question. So I'm not sure what the question is, actually. So let's talk about the Gospels first.
Okay.
The Gospels are written by, traditionally they're attributed to the 12 apostles and Mark, who was apparently supposedly a pupil of Peter in Rome. He supposedly wrote it in Rome. Luke was supposedly a friend of Paul's. I think most scholars today would say these were probably not who wrote the Gospels, that they were written by anonymous people, and they're some of the oldest Christian texts we have, and they sort of hung in there. All of them had a slightly difficult view or a difficult journey into becoming canon because different Christians in different regions used different Gospels, and the Gospels are not entirely complementary all the time on their details. But then there's a whole raft of other material about the apostles called the Apocrypha. So you have, I call them sort of the first form of fan fiction, which it was very unusual for someone in the first, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth century to have a book. It's very unusual for someone to have a copy of the New Testament. In fact, there wasn't a collected New Testament until the late 4th century. So there wasn't even an agreed upon collected group of Christian canonical writing until 363 or something like that. So prior to that, all any Christians had was the stuff that they'd hear their presbyters say. And so their imaginations would get fired up and they would go off and write about adventures of the apostles. And they were not very pious because they were basing these adventures on adventure stories from the Greco-Roman traditions. And they would try to endorse Christian theology, but because they didn't have books in front of them to double check with, their theology was often very shaky. So you have Jesus shape-shifting and growing a beard, and then it falls out, and then it grows back again, and fighting dragons and piloting ships, and apostles opening earthquakes and condemning 7,000 people to death. And then Jesus shows up and is like, "What did you do?" And then resurrects them all. And then he's like, "Don't do that again." There's one amazing one in the Acts of Philip, where Philip and Bartholomew meet a baby goat and a leopard, and they both talk. Like, animal spirituality was very interesting to a lot of the writers of the Apocrypha. There's just tons of it. The leopard and baby goat talk, they become friends, and they take communion together. And when Philip is crucified, his last request is, "Let the baby goat and leopard be there in my tomb." So what you see these early stories of the apostles were composed by very pious, very imaginative people. And the problem was that a lot of non-Orthodox Christians used these stories as the apostolic adventures, and so a lot of proper thinking Orthodox Christians condemned these texts and destroyed a lot of them. And the problem was that they didn't like the spirit, the theological content of them, but some of these texts contain the only information we had about what the apostles, where they went and what they did. So the first generation of Christian intellectual church fathers had a real problem on their hands, that there was no record of what happened to any of the apostles, but these stories that they condemned for their theological mistakes. And so, the texts that exist today are very incomplete. They're very fragmentary. It's very rare that you have a complete version of some of these apocryphal texts. And they're really weird, and they're not very good oftentimes. The Gospels, for all of their frustrations they cause a modern reader, are well composed and symmetrical and interesting, and they have detail and consideration, and the apocryphal stuff is just kind of a sprawling, terrible mess.
So when we talk about the history, often this is what it is. It's confusing. There's all sorts of versions. There's often no true certainty, the way we would, with, say, history today.
Zero.
Say, right. So let's get back to Isabel and Arthur. So when they're saying, we want to discover our history, what are they really talking about?
They want to discover the history that coheres with what their understanding of the history is. That John, the apostle, took Mary under his wing because he was a kind man and brought her to Ephesus, and that Mary was ascended to heaven when God decided it was time for her to go, and then John died of old age moments after finishing his gospel. That's the history that they want. But it's all just legend, and it's completely unverifiable. And so for me, I find the stories like so fascinating and weird and interesting in that they're the accidental autobiographies of early Christian communities trying to make sense of their stories and try to make sense of their place in the world. And a lot of them came before any idea that there was this holy book that was totally certain and 100% true, infallible, way before this stuff. And in fact, you see a lot of the early Christian theologians that I like a lot, including a guy named Origen, who read scripture completely unliterally and talks about the stupidity of literalist Christians is heavier than the sands of the sea. And he talks about how obviously no one could possibly believe Noah's Ark is true. It's obviously an allegory. And this guy, keep in mind, this was in like 230, in Alexandria. And this is a guy who's looking at Noah's Ark saying, obviously this is an allegory for how to survive in a hostile world. This can't. There wasn't really a Garden of Eden, And I sometimes think what Origen would say if he were to appear today and walk among us and look around and see how many people are adamant that all these stories be true. So Isabel and Arthur want their history, I think, to cohere with their belief, but that doesn't very often happen.
I want to ask you one more thing, then I was going to turn over for questions for you guys to open it up. In the introduction to the book, you write about how you were an altar boy. So you were very much of the church, the Catholic Church, until then basically, as the term goes, you lost your faith, so to speak. Although I would say maybe just the evidence didn't bear out, which is different. But diving back into all this material, I imagine it might have been quite a. I'm guessing, was there a long time since the last time you dove into scripture and to this sort of material? And if so, what was it like, kind of returning to this world?
Well, I've been working on this book. I've worked on it for 9 years. Wow. And then before that, I actually wrote a novel about one of the 12 apostles that was mercifully never published. But I worked on that for 5 years. So I've been living with this subject and this material for a long time. But I'll just, this might be interesting to some people here. I suspect it might be. As you say, I was Catholic, an altar boy, very enthusiastic altar boy, a very avid believer. It made sense to me. And then I read a review of A.N. Wilson's biography of Jesus in Time magazine. A.N. Wilson has since become a born-again Christian, but we'll forget that for now. But he wrote a biography of Jesus that seemed to attack the idea that Jesus was the Son of God. And I thought, well, I'm going to read that and review it for my sophomore English class. And I read it, and it opened my eyes up for the first time that Christian scripture is actually, translated from a language that is 2,000 years old, and that not every meaning is completely apparent. And not only that, if you compare variant manuscripts of the 600 or so copies of New Testament documents we have from the 1st to the 6th centuries, there's hundreds of thousands of difference spread between them. That kind of blew my mind. So not only are you dealing with translation of a language that is a form of Greek that is not even spoken or even thought by anyone on the planet today, you're talking about having no one consistent manuscript to base it off of. Those two facts kind of just short-circuited my belief that Christian scripture was just this block that fell from the sky and someone found it and thought, okay. And I realized that human fallibility intersected with our ability to understand scripture in about 1 million ways that I had never thought about. So I was a Catholic, and I never had one of these angry breakups with Catholicism. I just sort of read this book and thought, this isn't true the way I thought it was. And so my belief just sort of floated away. But I remained really interested in it because these are the stories that are how our civilization formed, right? And then I watched The Life of Brian. And there's the scene where Brian is running from the Romans, and he jumps into the marketplace, and there's all these prophets all gobbling around him. And Brian just starts like freelancing because he sees the Romans coming. And he's like, consider the lilies, how they grow. And once the Romans pass, and he's like, whew, phew. And then all the people are listening to him. They're like, yeah, go on. And then this escalates until they're convinced he's the Messiah. So it sounds absurd, and I'm only half joking when I say this, but like that seemed to me to offer a truer psychological rendering of what life in the first century was like than any of the sanitized Catholic educational film strips I'd seen. And so from that moment I started thinking, I was 20 years old, 19 years old, I was like, I want to write something about this period. So this is when I started this book about the Apostle John. And I worked on it for most of my 20s and eventually abandoned it. But in the process of working on it, I read that John's tomb was empty. It's the only one of the 12 apostles' tombs that was. And in the midst of this, I joined the Peace Corps, and it was in Uzbekistan, in which I read in a guidebook one day that they were supposedly a relic of Matthew in next-door Kyrgyzstan. And I thought, well, that's interesting. And then just one day, the thought just went, bing, travel book, 12 Apostles' Tombs. This was in 2006, and there are a couple people who knew me a year or two after that here when I was at work on this book, and if you would have told me that I'd still be working on it, 8 years later, I would have slapped you across the face because I would not have believed it. But that's just how long it took. And so, I must have read the New Testament a dozen times while I was working on this book.
But but it's clear from reading this book, even though you're not a believer, how much respect you have for this idea of people needing the church or needing this narrative.
We need stories, and stories are how we order ourselves. Stories are how we fix our own. They were how we fix ourselves in our culture and in our time and place. And there's just something I say at the very end of the book, which maybe I'll
Please
read really quick before we open it up. Anyone who derived meaning from art has no business claiming not to understand meaning derived from religion. Stories are part-time religions. Readers are temporary fundamentalists. And I really believe that novels that I've read that I love have given my life meaning and enrichment, and I think about fictional characters in those stories as they're as real to me as anything. I think the difference between me and a Christian is I don't insist that my stories be true. And not all Christians do insist their stories be true. There are lots of Christians who are open to the possibility that the Catholic Church, for instance, in the Second Vatican, they said not everything in the Gospels is exactly literal. Mm-hmm. And so there are tons and tons and tons of Christians who do not have a literal, ironclad view of the truth of the accounts in the Gospels. And one of my favorite scholars was a Roman Catholic priest named Raymond Brown, who actually said, if God has chosen to speak to us through metaphor or through poetry or through stories, who are we to take issue with how God chooses to communicate to us? And he viewed the storytelling impulse as one of the greatest tools that God spoke to human beings, because it's a language we instinctively understand.
Yeah, the parable.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. And so, when Jesus told the parables, the Pharisees didn't go out and investigate the factual veracity of them. That's not the point. So I think some Christians get upset when you give them it's just a beautiful story, lighten up treatment, because it's more than that to them, obviously. But I think there are a whole bunch of gradations between it's all bullshit, I hate this, and it's absolutely true, it must be true, or we're crazy. So I think there's, the vast majority of human consciousness exists between those two polar opposites in the way we understand these stories.
All right. Let's open up for questions from folks in the audience. Yes?
I had actually a couple questions. One was about John. And isn't Raymond Brown a scholar of John?
Yeah, he's probably the biggest. Yeah.
Isn't it thought that the John who was the beloved, who was there at the Last Supper, mm-hmm. wasn't the same John? Because it was too much time went by.
Well, there's a long section about this in the book. The people who study, they basically think that John was misidentified as the beloved disciple, right. And that's a mistake caused by a guy named Irenaeus, who was a 2nd century a Christian writer who was the first to put forth John as the author of the fourth gospel and the beloved disciple, and that seems to be a case of he mistook something. So there's like I said, there's a big section on it in the book.
My other question was about some of the Gospels that didn't make it into the canon. The Gospels that didn't make it into the canon. And you talked about Thomas a little, but I was wondering if you talk at all about the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, which only like little scraps have survived. But speaking of issues with Peter, there's like a big power
Yep.
struggle between her and Peter in
Yes,
the boat.
so it's weird. So in some of the, there was no what's the phrase I'm looking for? Monolithic Christianity in the first couple hundred years. There were just dozens of Christianities, and some strains of Christianity that were much more accommodating of having women who were prophets, and they really zeroed in on Peter, and for whatever reason, who knows? I don't think we can use that to say the historical Peter was a misogynist or anything, because there's just no evidence to go on that. But for whatever reason, these Christians focused on Peter as the center of their animus. And there's something where he says, like, women are not even worth being alive or something in that gospel, I think. And one of the apostles, James, the brother of Jesus, I think takes him aside and rebukes him for saying that. And so, yeah, Peter was a special focus of certain groups of Christians who really resented the patriarchal views of early Christianity. And all these alternative gospels that existed, most of them came after the canonical gospels. So a lot of people think that these gospels were excluded because they had unpopular messages, but maybe that's aspects of that are true, but it's mostly true that they just came later. And
You mean they were written later?
they were written later. Gospel of Thomas is maybe an exception to this, that may be older than the other Gospels. But it wasn't a story. The Gospel of Thomas is just a string of sayings. There's no narrative in it.
Right.
And some of the sayings are really odd and weird.
Well, so is John pretty odd and weird.
John is very odd and weird too, yeah. And John, if Irenaeus, the guy I had mentioned, hadn't lobbied for it, it likely wouldn't have made it into the canon, because
Wow.
it had a lot of very scary ideas to the Christian orthodoxy, foremost of which is that Jesus walks through walls. And one of the very early heresies that the church fought was that Jesus had to be a flesh and blood person. He wasn't a ghost after his resurrection. The resurrection was a bodily resurrection, and it was real. And yet John's Jesus appears in a locked room. And that gave ammunition to the Christians who said Jesus was an illusion. He wasn't a real human. He was a spirit. So a lot of the Gospels that did make it into the canon, even they had ideas that were super difficult for the early church to wrestle with. So it is. But the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, I mean, I've read a ton about it, but because she wasn't one of the 12 officially, I don't know. I don't talk about her. Yeah.
Yes.
I took 12 advanced classes about the whole life of Jesus and his testimony. Of course, I studied my Bible, for so many years. And you said that John is a favorite of Jesus.
Well, he was the beloved disciple.
Yeah, disciple.
Yeah.
See, my favorite in the New Testament is Gospel of John and Book of John, because we talk about the salvation and how Jesus he always talked to his Father, how Father loves him, sent him, his beloved Son Jesus, to the world and died for our sin as a Savior, so we have eternal life. He always mentioned Heavenly Father. He tell his disciples to love each other like Heavenly Father loved Jesus. And he loves, if you love each other, they can see the reflection of Jesus' love in them. And he mentioned like before, the day before he was crucified. And he talked very personal to Heavenly Father. He said, "Oh God, I have already fulfilled your will to glorify you, to come to the world, die for our sin as a Savior." How he always very personal about everything is Heavenly Father. He said he come to the world, not by himself. Heavenly Father, always mention Heavenly Father, eternal life. And of course the Book of John talk about God's love and all those. It's my two favorite with them.
You're
And
not
also
alone.
Peter, see how he denied Jesus 3 times because he afraid. So after Jesus resurrected and appeared to 500 people for 40 days, so Peter no longer scared in act. So one day in the synagogue he preached, 5,000 people accept Jesus. He no longer scared. And to me, you know, of course, you know, they scared because they will crucify him, Peter. And of course, all his disciples, I love all of those, you know, Matthew, Mark, Luke, you know, Gospel John, and everything. And Apostle Paul is one of the most, to me, he's the one who visits the light. You know, he's Jewish, but he become a Roman citizen as a militant.
Mm-hmm.
And he turned around because Jesus speaks to him. He cannot see the light. And that's why he is the one who you know, the captain wanted to assassinate him, but the captain saved his life.
Well, I think you're speaking to my point about
Yeah.
these stories
Yeah.
providing.
Yeah,
To
exactly.
me, it's fascinating.
Yeah.
The whole New
Yes.
Testament.
In India, did you have a chance to talk to any of the Indian Christians from the St. Thomas's?
I did, yeah. And the Indian Christians are very adamant. I call them fundamentalists about legend. They're very adamant that that St. Thomas came to India, that he was crucified, or excuse me, he was speared at this place. They claim to have the spear that was used to kill him, and there's a portrait that Luke supposedly painted of Mary, Jesus' mother, hanging in a chapel in Chennai. And like even real pretty sophisticated Indian Christians that I spoke to, one had a PhD, was like, well, these are absolutely authentic. And I'm like, whoa, yeah, really? And he's like, oh, absolutely. And I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
So it is very, very, very important to them, the antiquity of their faith and the legitimate and the authentic, the legitimate historical basis of their faith. Because Indian Christians are a pretty beleaguered minority. Not as bad as it could be, but they're only about 3% of it. What is it, 1%?
Mm-hmm.
There's 17 million, 23 million, I don't know. I have it in my book somewhere. Yes. They're a pretty small percentage of Indian civilization. And they've always been a small percentage of Indian civilization. But they've always also been there. So they've had to live alongside Hindus and Muslims, and Hindus and Muslims have not always been very kind to them. So their faith is really strong, and I think that fuels their you know, kind of unreasonable
Sure.
dogmatism about their relics and stuff.
But that seems to be true to also of other people in the book, that they really need to believe that those relics are there. That those things are. It's not a fancy, but that truly is the bone fragment of X.
Yeah. Yeah. It's tough.
Yeah. So I'm always curious about the kind of relationships between books for an author and sort of your path, and I'm thinking about
What path?
well,
A wandering path,
as
yes.
one who reads you. In terms of stories that consume you, I was thinking about was there any link between Extra Lives and Apostle in terms of a book like it would seem absurd, right, to make a link, but they're about, in some sense, stories that consume you. You know, like that. I mean, is there any? And also looking at the is there? I don't know. It's an absurdist question.
If Paul's right, you do get extra lives.
I don't know. I just, you know what writing a book is like. It's really hard, and you really got to love the subject. You really have to lose yourself in the subject to write at length about something, and you really have to be a crazy person to think that I'm going to convince strangers to hang with me for hundreds of pages writing about this thing. And so the subjects that I've taken have just been things that consume me, and my father's experience in Vietnam.
Correct.
It consumed my childhood in a lot
Well,
of
each of your
ways.
books seems like it's something you had to do.
Right, and so I'm out of autobiography now, so if you have any ideas for my next book, I am taking suggestions. So, no, I'm literally out of, I don't know what I'm going to write about now. I seem to have exhausted my passions, so...
You're young, we'll be good.
yeah, I'm not that young. Anyway.
Another question. No?
Did you read the Com Turbine, or have you Turbine, about the Testament of Mary?
I didn't read that,
And
no.
that's a really interesting, to
I'd
put
love to
that
read
like
that.
next to the people you met in Ephesus.
Yeah.
Because he gets, you know, into her, well, it's obviously a work of fiction,
Yes.
but the view he takes is definitely not the approved.
Not the orthodox
view.
versions? Yeah,
She's
I
like,
just,
they keep bothering me, they want me to conform to their story, and I won't.
I just read Nick Tosh's book Under Tiberius, which is a sort of
Oh,
alternative history of Jesus, in which Jesus is just a swindling con artist who, it's a pretty savage satire, but it's purported to be a Roman history that some historian wrote, and it's pretty good. My favorite historical fiction about New Testament times is a book by Brooks Hansen called John the Baptizer, which is an unbelievably intense, really well written, very straight account of John the Baptist's life, and it's really good. And the last 30 pages of it, but leading up to the whole moment, are just absolutely jaw-dropping. It's a really, really good book. I like it so much I put it in my bibliography. It's a novel. Yeah.
Yes.
Oh, me? Or-
Oh, right.
Yeah,
Thank
yeah.
you.
Did anything in your years of consideration and travel change your opinion about anything, or take you by complete surprise, that maybe close the gap between those poles? Like,
I think I became much more, we've all gone through, people who are no longer religious go through their angry stage, and I think I lost a lot of that anger about this stuff, that I think I'm much more, people's belief doesn't mystify me anymore. I don't get, when I meet, like one of my dear friends I've just made recently is a evangelical pastor from Illinois, and he and I talk a lot and we argue a lot, and he always says, "I'll pray for you," and that would have really irritated me before I wrote this book, and it doesn't anymore. I accept what he's saying, and why he's saying it, and I know why he's saying it. And I know that it's always his secret wish to convert me, and it will always be my secret determination to resist it. But I really, really like and respect him a lot, and I don't think that would have been a friendship I would have been able to have for this book. So, yeah. Ian.
Mine is sort of related to that. I'm curious about the community of faith that you came up in, and that, and then I imagine came to some terms with your previous sort of, leaving the flock a little bit. How did the process of researching and bringing this out, did you tell them? And then what has it in any way affected that relationship? And that sort of, what does that mean now?
You mean the people I was a Catholic with?
Sure. Or just, yeah, I mean,
Yeah, it was
you've been on your own journey with it.
It was a
but
bit of a
like,
rupture.
If I had left the clock like that and then said, hey, by the way, I'm going to spend 9 years writing a book about it, they'd be sort of excited. Maybe he's coming back.
No, there was some of that. My family was, I'm really the only one in my family that is not religious, and I think when I just sort of quietly announced that I was not going to go to church anymore, everyone thought it was just a phase, and I was sort of determined this isn't me. I actually liked going to church. I liked being an altar boy. I thought it was great. It was like Super Bowl Sunday every Sunday. I would show up and I'd put on the robes and I'd get to walk with the priest after the mass. I loved everything about it. And then when I left the church, my father in particular, who's a pretty avid Catholic because he made a battlefield wager with God. He was pretty horribly wounded in Vietnam and was bleeding to death on the side of a road in Vietnam. And he said, "God, if I get through this, I'm never going to doubt you again." I'm not going to quarrel with my dad's faith. It's not a lot we can talk about. That's the source of his faith, and I don't mock it or dispute it. But he's also a pretty thoughtful guy. I think he's open to the validity of other religious understandings, and I think he thinks everyone sort of gets to God on their own terms, through their own cultures, so he's reasonable about it, and I can easily have a conversation with someone like that. But there are other members of my family that I think when they knew I was working on this, I think they thought that when I surveyed the vast majority of the material, I would see the necessity of my, coming back to the faith. And this writer that I mentioned, A.N. Wilson, who wrote this really brilliant but kind of skeptical biography of Jesus, like recently converted back to his faith. Hell, I guess anything's possible. I mean, I don't know. I'm not going to say never, but I highly doubt it.
It's interesting when you mention fictional characters. You know, when you're talking about the power of fictional characters and how they can have a great deal of meaning. Don Quixote came to my mind. You know, there's an incredible fictional.
He may as well be a religious figure. That's how indelible he is.
Yeah. Just remarkable, and yet from the mind of Cervantes.
Yeah.
All right, should we go ahead and end it there?
Yeah, that's a good.
Yeah, all right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone.